Hey, it's Captain Ron with Red Chaser Guide Service. Welcome back to School of Redfish, Redfish 101. Today we're going to be on Chapter 2 of Redfish 101. Last week, of course, was our first chapter. It was on where to find redfish, the types of terrain and areas that I look for to target, particularly great big redfish, how to find those areas and what it can mean to you when you're fishing. Today we're going to talk about what they do, redfish feeding behaviors, what you see redfish do in the marsh, and what it means they're feeding on and that they're doing when you see these certain behaviors, and how to target based on that. So without too much further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. Redfish 101, Chapter 2, What They Do, Redfish Feeding Behaviors. So there's a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different things that redfish do in the marsh. And the kind of the cool thing is, one of the things I really enjoy about these fish is that within the realm of sight fishing for redfish in shallow water, there's a lot of different scenarios that you could catch them in, all within that realm of shallow water sight fishing, based on what they're doing and how they're behaving and how you target them in those circumstances. So the first broad category is tailing. And within tailing redfish, well, there's different nuances to that. The first activity that falls within tailing, I call tipping along. Now, this is when a redfish is oriented, swimming along pretty much horizontal to the surface of the water, and as he's swimming along, you see the tail, usually just the tip of the tail, breaching the surface. Sometimes the dorsal fin will breach the surface too. Now, this happens when the redfish are swimming along, cruising along, again at a parallel to the surface of the water, and they're either crossing something particularly shallow that kind of forces them up and makes them breach the water surface, or they're just really happy and swimming high in the water column. And as they're swimming along, their tail is breaching the surface. Now, the cool thing is, they're usually relaxed and happy doing this. And if we're able to get a good presentation in front of a redfish that's tipping along, this is the usual result. You get to eat, and it's fish on. And in this case, it was a 27-pound fish on. Now, if it looks smaller than that, it's because Jimmy here, he's about 6'3", young man's a football player, a big old boy. Now, here's another example of a redfish tipping along. The good thing is that in this video, you'll be able to actually see the redfish itself in the water to give you an idea of its attitude and what it's doing as it's doing this. See that tip of the tail just barely kind of breaching the water surface now and then. That fish is swimming along again, horizontal to the surface of the water. Now he's traveling pretty shallow. He's up close to that bank, and that's an example of tipping along. And as you saw, eventually, sometimes the dorsal fin will come out too. And what's better than a fish tipping along? Well, how about two big redfish tipping along, nice and happy? And again, they're swimming parallel across a shallow area. And by the way, this one and the last one, these were 10 minutes apart, 50 feet away from each other. And as you can see, it's a pair of nice fish moving along. Now, again, when they're doing this, a lot of times it is feeding behavior, but a lot of times it's just them very casually and in a relaxed manner moving from point A to point B, but still very catchable fish. As that fish is crossing you, if he's crossing you horizontally, like in the first video, if you can get that fly, 2 feet in front of and 1 foot past the fish, so that when you make one medium speed strip, that fly is going to be in the fish's face. You can generally get the eat on the fish, and it's a it's a cool thing to see, and it's a very high probability shot when you get that. Now, also within tailing, we get fish standing on their head doing headstands. This is when that fish is focused on a specific food item in the bottom, very likely a crab, sometimes maybe like a little benthic worm or something like that, and they're standing on their head. They are nose down in the mud, the tail sticking straight up out the water all the way down to the wrist or peduncle. And to present to these fish, and by the way, in this picture, you see on the blades of grass behind it, these little snails are called periwinkles. Sometimes those fall in the water, the fish will be feeding on that, and that could well be the case here. But in this instance, so you can tell by the spot on the tail, the fish's back is on this side and its stomach is on this side. So if he does go back horizontal, his head's going to be facing over this way. So what I would do is I would throw the fly just past the fish, basically try to land it right on the edge of that grass here. Let the fly settle to the bottom because he's head down, and slowly fish that fly, pretty much dragging it on the bottom, right across by that fish to see if you get ate. Now, a lot of times when they're doing this, because their head is down in the mud, they're stirring up the mud, clouding up the water. And so it may be difficult for them to see the fly. Additionally, they could just be so hyper focused on whatever it is they're eating on or trying to eat off the bottom that you can't get their attention readily with the fly. What I'll do in that circumstance sometimes is drop the fly right here by the fish. But when I drop the fly, I try to get it to hit the surface of the water with a bit of a splat, because that'll sometimes get the fish's attention and get them to look up, and you can get to eat that way. So this morning I was fishing with Aaron and his friend Eric, and we were back in this bayou over this direction, poling out this way. And as I was poling out this way, I could see this fish tailing kind of in this area. Big fish, tail way up out the water, absolutely doing headstands. So I told Aaron here, I said, Aaron, I said, as soon as the bow of the boat crosses that point, you can have a good shot on this fish. So I keep poling. The bow of the boat crosses the point. Aaron makes a cast at the fish. The fish moves forward and tips down and does a headstand on the fly. And it tips down so hard that the fish actually kind of falls over onto its back. It goes over end to end in the water onto the fly. Now, luckily, even though the fish was oriented on its back at the moment, it managed to get the fly in his mouth, and Aaron caught it. It was well in excess of 30 pounds. He named her Large Marge, which was pretty fitting, and it was a very memorable and exciting fish. But so again, when they're doing headstands, that tail sticking out the water, they're feeding on the bottom. It'll often be crabs or little invertebrate and worm type stuff, snapping shrimp, things that tend to kind of hold their ground in the bottom. Your regular shrimp, like your white shrimp and your brown shrimp, they're usually going to attempt to swim away, so they may not be, like lodged at the bottom like that, where that fish is going to be doing headstands on them. Then you get milling schools. This is when fish are tailing in these milling schools. I see this more often than not kind of in the marshy duck pond backwater that I talked about in chapter one. Maybe not as much out on the edge. Generally, they do this when there's a lot of aquatic vegetation. Like these fish are doing this in weed grass. I'll see them do it too in hydrilla. And this school of fish is sitting there with a bunch of tails poking out the water, and the school's not really moving anywhere. The fish are just kind of milling around in place as they're bumping and eating shrimp out of the grass. These are really happy fish. They're usually really easy to feed. They're also usually pretty approachable. They're focused on the food. Also, having that vegetation there provides a little bit of buffer against them feeling the pressure wave from the boat or hearing any little bit of maybe hull slap or whatever. So those are usually very catchable fish. You drop a fly in the middle of that, and there's a high likelihood you're going to get eaten. Sometimes when they're doing pretty much the same behavior, instead of the tail sticking up, it'll actually be their backs breaching up like this. But this is still a school of fish just kind of milling around in one spot, slurping on stuff, and you'll see shrimp popping out the water, and occasionally the fish will kind of pop on the surface and make a slurping noise as they're eating. Excuse me, sorry for the hiccup there. Then sometimes you'll get fish crawling and showing cleavage. And this is kind of my favorite way to target redfish. It's just neat. You see redfish, they get up so shallow that their entire back is sticking up out the water. Generally, this is going to happen on a shallow sloping bank. They love to do that, or a shallow sloping area. Here's video of one crawling. I apologize that it's kind of grainy and maybe not the best quality video, but it can give you an idea at least of what it looks like when they're crawling. Here you go. There's your crawler up over here, and he's just making way. So, when a redfish is crawling back out the water, they're exposed. It's a spot where they're exposing themselves, and there's only one reason redfish are going to get up that shallow and expose themselves, and that's to eat. So when you see crawlers, they are eating, which means you can feed them. However, when they're crawling, again, they're exposed. They know they're exposed, so they can be pretty spooky. Your shots have to be good. It's really easy to spook the fish. Now you can see the crawlers right here. It'll get a little bit more visible as we go. And normally on crawlers, I like to drop the fly just past and just a little bit of ahead of them, and as slowly as possible, drag that fly on the bottom in front of the fish so it looks like a little crab dragging on the bottom, maybe kicking up mud. As you saw here, that fish spooked, and it didn't spook. The cast didn't land too close to the fish. It spooked probably because when the cast was made, the boat was rocked a little bit, and the fish felt the boat. So when they're crawling, they're eating, they're feedable. You have to feed them very close because when they're crawling, their sight window is much more limited. Their water so shallow, it limits their sight window. Part of the reason crawlers might be my favorite is because the first redfish I ever caught on fly was a crawler. I had never seen crawlers before, and I was running down the Calcasieu Ship Channel to go to Turner's Bay at the north end of Calcasieu Lake to fish for speckled trout. They were schooling under birds. And as I was running, I saw a splash in the back of a cove off of the channel, and the splash had a glint of red in it. So I idled down. I was running an old Monarch 14-foot aluminum boat that leaked like a sieve at the time. So I started idling toward that cove, and I see these dark shapes moving across the surface of the water. And at first, I thought that it was either nutria or otter or something like that. Then I realized it was actually redfish backs as they were swimming back and forth, crawling. And I pulled up in there and managed to catch my first redfish ever on fly. And I had tried for that redfish for a long time because at the time, this would have been in, I don't know, maybe 1996. There were very, very few people fly fishing for redfish in Louisiana. There were a few folks doing it on the east side of the state. Guys like Bubby Rodrigue and Mark Brockhoff and Kurt Dietrich were doing it. On my side of the state at the time, I was living on the west side of the state in Lake Charles at the time, which I don't anymore. There were very, very few people doing it. And so the learning curve was steep for me. I had to just get out there and see it and experience and find it and do it and learn the tides and all that. And so it took me a while, but I finally caught that first redfish on fly. It was a crawler, and I've been hooked ever since. And that was about 30 years ago. Now a lot of times you'll see redfish running the shoreline. What happens sometimes, the tide comes in, it kind of floods the marsh grass. Then as that tide starts falling, usually kind of like the last third of the tide, the water starts getting pulled out of that grass. And as the water's getting pulled out of the grass, it's bringing bait with it. And the redfish will be just cruising the edge of that grass, blown up on whatever's getting pulled out of the grass, and it's usually shrimp. In fact, in this instance, this is a little pack of redfish. When they're running the shorelines, sometimes it'll be little packs like this, little twos, threes, and fives. Sometimes it'll be singles. But you can see if you look here and here and here, you can see these little bitty shrimp. These are grass shrimp, but a lot of times the same thing happens with like juvenile white shrimp or juvenile brown shrimp. Kind of another example of it. These fish just coming down that shoreline. Now, when they're cruising the shoreline, they're usually moving at a pretty good clip. I tell people that in general, when you see a redfish and it's a crossing shot, cast 2 feet ahead of and 1 foot past the fish. That way, one strip is going to have that fly in the fish's face. You'll get the eat. Don't cast too far in front of the fish. However, you do have to make adjustments for that. You do these little mental time, distance, speed calculations. Okay, I see how fast the fish is moving. I need to make a cast this far ahead of it to make sure that I intercept the fish with the fly. Now, the fly still needs to end up passing right in front of that fish's nose, generally within, a foot or less of the fish's nose. But if the fish is, a lot of times when the fish are cruising the grass line like this, they're moving at a pretty good clip. So you may need to open up that lead a little bit and cast them a little further. Just make sure that you still intercept the fish with that fly, and that fly ends up, on that fish's nose. Then you get schools of redfish pushing, and there's a couple of different scenarios for this. One of them is when the redfish are getting ready to spawn, they form spawning aggregates or schools. Normally, this occurs in the major passes near the outside edge or just offshore, like on the beaches, because when redfish spawn, they need full Gulf salinity to spawn successfully because they scatter their eggs, the eggs are fertilized, and the eggs are buoyant when you have full Gulf salinity. Anything less than that, the eggs will sink to the bottom. If they sink to the bottom, they're not viable. However, these schools sometimes will push onto shallow areas, particularly in September of 2023. We had a massive drought. Because of the drought, salinity levels were very high, much farther inland than normal. So we had these spawning schools coming in farther. So this little group here came by. John made a cast, missed the fish, but not to fret because look what's coming up behind it, a much larger group of fish. And those are all fish that are like over 20 pounds. So John and I were in this cove, and these spawning aggregates were coming through this cove one after another. And we sat there, caught a bunch of fish. Then we moved to another shallower cove, kept catching fish. We ended this day with like 13 bulls over 20 pounds, a bunch of slot fish, a bunch of black drum. Really cool day. With these spawning aggregates, the fish will eat. However, it's not the primary thing on their mind. They're thinking about doing a little something, something. And because of that, you see this school of fish, you might think that, oh, if I just lob a fly anywhere in there, it's going to get eaten. Not always the case. Sometimes you really need to feed these fish. So when you're fishing and you have these spawning aggregates or these schools of fish more on the outside edge, closer to the edge, closer to the Gulf, you see the school coming by, you want to pick a fish and cast at a fish and feed a fish. If you pick a fish to cast to and get the fly, a foot in front of his face, you're a lot more likely to catch that fish than if you just kind of randomly throw up in the middle of the school. And that's not to say you won't catch thrown up in the middle of the school, because obviously there's a lot of fish moving through there. There's a pretty good chance it'll end up in front of somebody's nose, but you're going to do better if you pick a fish. Now, what you could do to hedge your bet is pick a fish that's set into the school a little bit, not so far in that you're going to line the school, but far enough in that, you can throw your leader into that school and it's not going to bug him like the fly line. So let's say a fish that's 6 feet into the school, so that if he doesn't eat it as you're stripping out, that fly is still going to end up or has a good chance of ending up in front of other fish. Now, the other scenario where you have these schools that are pushing as opposed to schools milling around is you'll have fish that school up for the purpose of feeding. This happens. So fish, redfish in particular, their behavior is going to be based on what the most efficient way to feed is as at that time. And it becomes very efficient for fish to feed in schools when there is a very high density of bait. And what I see a lot of times, really more in the back marsh than out on the edge, is they'll farm these big feeding schools in some of the larger ponds and larger bodies, and they'll be pushing through the aquatic vegetation, through the grass. And as they push through that grass, shrimp are popping out of the grass all over, and everybody's getting something to eat. And when you see these schools moving, you'll see shrimp popping out in front of them. In fact, a good indicator a lot of times, if I'm poling into the marsh and I see a lot of shrimp popping out in front of the boat, I'll kind of be on the lookout, because oftentimes that means that the density of the shrimp is so high that those fish are going to want to school up to eat, because at that time, with that bait density, that's the more efficient way for them to eat. These schools, these feeding schools like this that they're pushing, it's not these milling tails, but what happens is you literally see this dark line moving across the surface of the water, and it's like the bow wake of the school. And when you've got a big number, 50, 100, sometimes even 200 fish that are, say, anywhere from 10 to 14 pounds pushing, they're going to push a wake. Now, the other thing is these big feeding schools, when they're moving, they're moving. You're not going to catch up to them from directly behind, either on the push pole or the trolling motor. Number one, just their normal speed is going to be too quick for that. And number two, if you start trying to press them from behind, they start feeling that pressure weight from the boat, and they'll just increase their speed and keep going. So what I'll do is I'll get out there and I'll look, kind of the time of year that I suspect they're going to be doing this. And if I see that dark line moving across the surface of the water, that bow wake of the fish, or if I see birds working them, because very commonly when the fish are schooling like this, you'll have either a single gull or flocks of gulls working the school, because those fish are making shrimp pop out of the water all over. What I like to do is determine the speed and direction that the fish are moving, do like a 400-yard dash on the push pole, get in front of the fish. Everybody takes a shot, hooks up. The school moves on. You land your fish, then you go back and you find the school again. And that's that behavior, and that's kind of how I target them in those instances. And then sometimes fish are just eating. They may not be doing any of these real specific behaviors. Sometimes you may hear a blow up, or you may be pulling along and you see a little pile of oysters, a little small oyster reef, and you'll see a couple of fish just kind of tootling around the edge of it. They're not breaking the surface. They're not doing any of these real specific behaviors, but they're in there eating, and you can tell a lot about whether they're eating or not on their body language. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in chapter 3 of Redfish 101. And then again, sometimes you just hear a fish blow up because he just ate something. So I'm not a big fan of having music playing in the skiff. And the reason for that is because countless times I've caught fish that I was first made aware of because I heard them blow up. And a lot of times you can even tell that it's a redfish by the way the blow up sounds. When a redfish blows up, if you look at a redfish, particularly as they get bigger, that front end of them is kind of rounded. They're rounded up front. And when a redfish blows up, it sounds like something round. It sounds like somebody dropping a bowling ball in the water. Whereas, say, a garfish, garfish has a long, bigger, flatter head. When a garfish blows up, it sounds like more of a splat. You'll actually learn the nuance of these things. But at any rate, there's been many times I've heard a redfish blow up. It drew my attention to the specific area, went and caught the fish. One of my more recent charters, that exact thing happened. We'd been having a challenging day, We'd had cloud cover with poor visibility plus high water that was off color. We were in fish all day, but the issue was that the majority of them we weren't seeing until it was pretty much too late and they were blowing out. And late in the day, we heard a blow up behind a point. I started pulling toward that point. This fish swam out around the point, and my angler caught his biggest fish of the trip. And it was because we heard the fish blow up first. So always be aware of that. Have your head on a swivel and have all of your senses alert because you never know what's going to give away the presence of a fish. And in fact, I'll even give you a funny tidbit. You'd be surprised at what your sense of smell can do for you. In saltwater fishing, particularly with speckled trout fishing, when you'll hear people talk about fishing slicks, and that's say you're running a bay and the water is all consistent colored and has a little ripple on it. And all of a sudden, you see a little patch, maybe 5 or 6 feet across, that looks slick and greasy, and it's circular. Well, that's a slick, and that's usually caused by a predatory fish eating bait, and the oils from that bait that it just ate and chewed up floats to the surface and creates this literal slick on the surface. Well, what's odd is if you're passing downwind from a freshly made slick, you'll get a hint of a watermelon smell. You could be running the bay and smell watermelon, stop the boat and look upwind, and pretty good chance you're going to see a slick that lets you know that there's some predatory fish feeding there. Anyway, that's not something I use a whole lot red fishing, but I just thought I'd share that anecdote because I find it kind of amusing. So, getting into what redfish eat, Corey, they're very opportunistic. In general terms, redfish are going to avail themselves anything that presents an easy meal. The most effective redfish fly is the one that's right in front of their nose. It's much more about where you put the fly than what the fly looks like. And so that means A, casting at the right spot, and B, having a fly that sinks with the right sink rate, which I usually like a fair amount of lead on my flies. So, and then general color and shape is good. It's more about profile than really matching a hatch. Favorites of redfish include white shrimp, brown shrimp, Hayden or pogies, mullet, blue crabs, and other crabs, plus cacao minnows. They call them cacao minnows or mud minnows, but they really are as Gulf killifish. Those are all things redfish like. I've seen them feasting on needlefish before. Kind of like I said, they're opportunistic and something that gives them a good opportunity to eat. They're going to get after it. So there can be a seasonal component to a redfish's diet. Texas Parks and Wildlife did some great research in Galveston Bay. And unfortunately, I've not been able to find similar research to this that was done in Louisiana, but I think it translates. So they did this research in Galveston Bay, sampling stomach contents of redfish. Now, the caveat here is that all of the fish they surveyed were under 29 inches. And I do think that there is some nuance in feeding, seasonal feeding patterns with larger fish versus smaller fish. So in the fall, redfish in general are feeding largely on white shrimp. And Texas Parks and Wildlife found that 60% of stomach contents by number were white shrimp on redfish in the fall. But again, they were surveying these fish that were 29 inches and under. What I see, and I've seen it abundantly, is that the big bull redfish in the fall like to get on big mullet. And kind of what happens is late August, those redfish go out and spawn, and they're spawning usually through right at the beginning of October, and they're going to expend a lot of energy spawning. In fact, if you catch a big bull redfish right after the spawn, a lot of times what you'll have is a giant head, a giant tail, and a skinny cylindrical body. Well, after the spawn, they come inshore looking to fatten up. In fact, you catch that fish in October, early November, and it looks like I just described. If you catch that same fish in January, it reminds me of when you see pictures of grizzly bears just before they hibernate and they're so fat they can barely walk. Well, that's what happens. By January, these fish fatten up. And so what I've seen is these fish are coming in after the spawn. They're looking to fatten up, and they get on mullet. They get on big mullet. And I've seen this in a lot of different ways. A, just following schools of mullet and seen schools of redfish following them, and the fish blowing up on them. There's a feeding behavior that I didn't describe earlier that I really just witnessed for the first time this year, but I witnessed it a few times this year or this past year, and I noticed it in a couple of different locations. And this was kind of November, December. There's a couple of areas where there's a small pass, just a little bit of a channelized pass that connects two shallow flats. And there's a few areas where this kind of duplicates. And the little pass was maybe 4 to 6 feet deep. And what would happen was mullet, particularly on the incoming tide, would get balled up densely in these little passes. And I think actually what was happening was dolphin were balling the mullet up in the pass. And once the dolphin had their fill and moved off, bull redfish came in and were blitzing on these balls of mullet in these little passes. And I think the reason I was seeing it happen where there's a little more water, like 4 to 6 feet, is for these redfish to blitz, they need to be able to get under the mullet, and accelerate and bust up through them. And it was really cool to watch these big old redfish blitzing on these mullet, coming completely out of the water, torpedoing out of the water. And with the amount of activity going on, the number of redfish you knew were there, you, you get excited about it. They're difficult to catch though, because there's so much bait there. There's like 10,000 mullet there. So getting your fly notice was tough. And I tried different things. I threw poppers that were noisy. I would try throwing a big fly, letting it sink below the mullet and stripping, and we'd catch a fish here and there, but it wasn't super consistent. What we found worked was if you waited and watched, a lot of times just before they torpedoed and blew up, you would see the big redfish float up near the surface. And when you saw the fish float up, if you were able to drop the fly on their nose, you could get eat. Now, the other thing that I saw too is we were in one of these little passes and the redfish were blitzing on the mullet, and the school of mullet was getting decimated and decreased in size. And finally, when the school of mullet was reduced down to a ball that was only like 3 feet across, I had my angler drop his fly on the backside of that ball of mullet. And at that point, the fly could get noticed, and this 42-inch redfish immediately torpedoed out the water and ate the fly. Yes, Nolan, I'm talking about you. And it was a really cool thing. So that was a fitting behavior too. But again, I'm seeing in the fall, these fish coming in wanting to get on the big fish, wanting to get on mullet so that they can fatten up. And that's a little contrary to what the Texas Parks and Wildlife study showed. But I think that's the distinction between, these fish that are mature bulls, 20 pounds and up versus, fish that are 29 inches and under. So as spring progresses, redfish overall shift focus from shrimp to primarily finfish. Again, menhaden or pogies, if you'd rather, mullet, Gulf killifish, and other fish. And now what I've seen a lot in spring, maybe pushing towards summer, in really shallow tidal ponds or in shallow creeks, where you get kind of a sloping bank, a shallow sloping bank, I'd see redfish charging up that slope, chasing bait up, and a lot of times it was those mud minnows, those Gulf killifish. And when the redfish are really focused on those mud minnows, is when I see them like the fattest. I mean, they look like footballs with big distended bellies. The other thing that happens in a lot of our estuary, kind of in Mayish, is in early May, is these huge numbers of juvenile pogies, little menhaden about an inch long, come in, and you will literally be in the middle of millions of them. The entire surface, as far as you can see, is covered with them. And you're on a shallow flat. There's these millions of juvenile menhaden, and redfish are blown up everywhere. It sounds like people are lobbing grenades in the water. And again, a lot of activity. And you're thinking, man, I'm going to rack up. But again, it's not easy to catch these fish. And in this case, for a couple of reasons. One is because there is so much bait, it can be tough to get your bait noticed. But the other is because this is an instance where redfish go into ambush predator mode. Generally, redfish are itinerant feeders. They generally don't do like, say, a bass or a snook and park in one spot waiting for the bait to just swim by them to blow up on. They're generally on the hunt. Now, they may be hunting a general area, like there might be a reef, and they're circling that reef looking for food, but they're still on the move. Or there might be a series of a couple of cuts in the bank, and the fish will work that area of the bank looking for food, but they're still on the move, itinerant, they're hunting, they're predatory. What I've seen in this instance when all those menhaden are moving through is they will actually pick a spot. Maybe it's a point, maybe it's the mouth of a cut, maybe it's just a place in the flat where there's a little bit of a depression, and they will sit and they'll act kind of like a flounder. They'll wait for this massive number of menhaden to come over them, and then they blow up on them and get a bite to eat. And what becomes challenging is you see the blow up. However, when those redfish pop up and blow up on the menhaden, they don't return to the exact same spot that they were in when they blew up. They may slide over 8 or 10 feet. So throwing right where you saw the blow up doesn't normally yield a fish. But because the fish are laying up waiting for bait, they're not moving, so they're a lot harder to track than fish that are moving and cruising around. And so you get in this scenario where you see all this activity and you're thinking you're going to just load the boat with fish, and you end up catching three or four. So finally, crabs are always on the menu year round. Redfish love to eat crabs. And what was interesting, that study that the Texas Parks and Wildlife did showed that the majority of the crabs eating, now keep in mind, they're surveying fish 29 inches and smaller, and the majority of the crabs they found were 2 to 3 inches or bigger. They weren't eating little 25-cent piece size crabs. They were eating substantial crabs. And I've seen it. I've caught and kept 3 pound redfish that had a 5 inch crab inside of them. So hopefully this gives you a little background on some of the things, A, what redfish like to eat, but B, what their behavior becomes based on what they're eating and how to target them when you're witnessing certain feeding behaviors. I hope you found this useful. If you found it useful, please do me a favor, like this video and subscribe. And hey, if you didn't find it that useful, still subscribe because maybe the next one will be of more benefit to you. Also, please share this video with friends that need it. Drop a comment below. I'm going to be back next week with chapter 3 of Redfish 101, and it's going to be all about what you need to be able to do on the front of the boat to catch these redfish. Thanks so much for joining me here, and I'll see you next week.